Welcome to another episode of Decomposing Messiaen. It's a series of videos where I am walking through Technique de mon langage musical, which is a text written by Olivier Messiaen in the 1940s, where he describes the attributes and characteristics of his musical techniques. Each episode roughly aligns to one of the chapters in the book. Today is chapter 8. Eagle-eyed listeners will recall that the previous episode, just before the new year, was chapter 9, and the one before that was chapter 7. So I inadvertently skipped chapter 8. I'm going to rectify that today by spending time and attention on melody and melodic contours, which is the subject of chapter 8. Now, as with all of these episodes, I'll talk through the text of the chapter, probably go on some tangents, and then spend time at the piano. Messiaen provides many musical examples for each of the ideas that he presents, most of them from his own music. And this chapter is very heavily weighted towards the musical examples. There's only 3 or 4 paragraphs of text, and there's a couple dozen examples. So I'll be spending much more time over here. And relatively less time over here. Before I get into the chapter, I thought I would just take a moment and restate why I'm doing this, and why you're listening and enjoying it. On the one hand, yes, there is a real sort of compositional, technical interest in going through the text, right? There's a theoretical problem and a theoretical process to understand what Messiaen is saying about his music. I bring in sometimes academic articles that reference this material, that extend on this material. There are some books that I've referenced that kind of augment what's in the text, because I'm trying to do, on one hand, kind of a comprehensive, serious study of the material. But on the other, and on a larger sense, I really do believe that the study of music is a prism through which the study of the human experience can be understood. And like a prism, the phenomena of music can then split into multiple different bands, each of which is a meaningful partial of the original whole. That when we talk about music and when we think about music, whether it is as composers or as performers or as listeners, that conversation aligns really nicely to the conversation about what it is to be a human. The musical phenomenon is a great analogy for the human phenomenon. And within that conversation, I think, personally, the music of Messiaen is a particularly well-suited use case, that Messiaen's music conspicuously sets out that process. Messiaen was a very spiritual composer, of course, associated with the Catholic Church as an organist and as a liturgist through his entire life. Most of his music has subtitles and context that is deliberately referring to liturgy, whether it's quoting plain chants, whether it's quoting scripture, whether it's for use in a liturgy or whether it's for the concert hall, whether he's looking at the larger sort of environment of sound, whether it's bird song or nature sounds. These are also resonant with the spiritual interest that his music has. And so when we study the way that Messiaen writes his music, he is writing his music to point us in that direction in different ways, either to suggest something behind the music or within the music to recreate some kind of sensation. So when we study Messiaen's musical techniques, we are studying his thinking about the overlap of human physiology and spirituality. So you can see how that really is a wonderful immediate use case for the general thought that music and humanness are inextricably entwined, and talking about one is a good way of talking about the other. So that's why I'm doing it. And when I do it, I use the text as an anchor. I start with the text, and hopefully do provide some useful thoughts if you are a student of Messiaen and are looking in these videos for information about the techniques. Hopefully you get something from that. But this is not meant for a purely technical audience, and quite the opposite. If you are coming here for purely technical information, you may end up being disappointed, and I apologize for that. So let's dig in. Chapter 8, Melody and Melodic Contours. I mentioned it was short. It is, in fact, little more than a single double-sided page. I should note, as my first tangent, I recently acquired a copy of the book in French. So I've been working off a PDF that I downloaded and printed of an English translation, and it's certainly very useful to have that. But one of my larger objectives is to improve my own comprehension for French. And ultimately, once I've completed this review of the musical language technique, Messiaen has written an enormous treatise, a 7-volume treatise on music and birdsong and rhythm. Many of the same topics that he introduces in this relatively small book, he elaborates at great length in the treatise. And as far as I know, the first volume of that is available in a translation that was completed for a dissertation study, but the other volumes have not been translated into English, as far as I know. And even if they have, I think that it will be quite wonderful to be able to read through in French. So now that I have the French copy, I may introduce some of my translation problems into these videos as I go along. If that's something that's interesting to you, you should let me know in the comments. It might be worth having a little sidebar or occasional briefs where I focus in on translation. So anyway, this is nice to have. I won't be referring to it today. One thing that's nice about this is that the musical examples are aligned directly with the text, whereas the PDF that I have in the translation, they are in 2 separate volumes. So I'll put this aside for now over here. And now let's get down to it. So, starting with the text, supremacy to melody, ! Is how Messiaen begins this chapter. The noblest element of music, may melody be the principal aim of our investigations. It's interesting that he comes to it second. He begins with a rhythm in the text and then moves to melody. Let us always work melodically. Rhythm remains pliant and gives precedence to melodic development, the harmony chosen being the true, that is to say, wanted by the melody and the outcome of it. Okay, so right off the bat, he's created a hierarchy of the vectors of musical composition. If you can consider composition as rhythm, melody, and harmony, then rhythm and harmony are in the service of melody in this structure. Now recall, at the very beginning of the book, Messiaen drew a distinction between composition and musical language. A composition textbook would require all kinds of discussion around orchestration, structure, different kinds of information about the craft of composition that he's not going to talk about in this book. So when he says melody and rhythm and harmony, you shouldn't think that means that he is distilling composition to just those 3 elements. He is describing his musical language in those three elements, and of them, he is saying that melody is supreme. Now, when you think about his background and his context, where plain chant is absolutely music, melody in the service of text, the text being in service of the liturgy being in service of the spirit. And I think that this is a very deliberate placing of the hierarchy. The rhythm is there, I think, and I've talked about this in the other chapters. Messiaen isn't quite explicit about this, but I believe the rhythm forms a foundation that is deliberately physiological, that the ametricality of the rhythm that Messiaen typically uses, right? This sort of the focus on prime numbers, groups of 5 and 7. The augmentation of rhythms where you'll state something in 5 and then add in a value and allow the meter to be embellished and evolved through these processes of augmentation and diminution. Fairly mechanical processes when you get down to it. Those are there to provide a surface baseline for the body to rest in. That's my language, although I think it's supported by the way Messiaen talks about rhythm. It allows the body. It's one of those things I was talking about that the music can point to a message beyond, or it can recreate within. And I think the rhythm recreates within, and I'm going to say that I think the melody points beyond because the melody is textual, even when there is no text associated with it. So, this chapter is, in one sense, quite light. He's talking about melody and melodic contours, but it is in later chapters that he talks more specifically about structure of melody. He has a very well-defined sense of melodic accent, preparation and accent. It's based on plain chant, but in turn it's based on ancient Greek processes of rhetoric. And he gets into that in the future chapters. In this chapter, he really is just laying out what is a melody. I mean, a melody is an alignment of notes that does a certain thing. So he starts off by talking about particular intervals that are important melodically. And the first and most important interval that he highlights is the tritone. And Messiaen uses the tritone melodically to generate tension, but he primarily uses it as a cadence, as a means of ending a phrase, which is contradictory to common practice in the most extreme way, in the most extreme deliberate sort of shift. I figured I'd stop faffing around at the desk and just get over to the piano and talk through directly at the piano, because most of this really only makes sense when you have the sound in front of you. So I was talking about the interval of the tritone. He introduces this in his example 70. He says, "Let us encroach a little upon the domain of chapter 13, which is yet to come," right? It's the more formal definition of the melody. "And recall that a very fine ear clearly perceives an F sharp in the natural resonance of a low C." Now, of course, what he's talking about here is the overtone series, the fundamentals, right? So there's the low C, octave, fifth, and there's the F sharp. And what he's saying is that if we were to really analyze the overtones of that low C, the F sharp is part of it. And he's very highly attuned to that. So example 71, he just takes the 71, which is such an enormously characteristic Messiaen gesture. I'm calling it the tritone. He calls it the descending augmented fourth. It's the same thing. So we have the tritone as a cadence. Then he talks about the major sixth, which I think he views the major sixth as kind of the perfect outline of a melody. Now, of course, Messiaen's melodies are highly disjunct, particularly when he is referring to birdsong. But within the context of a theory of melodic structure, I think what he's saying is that the perfect sixth. What he says is because of the importance of the added sixth in the perfect chord, foreseen by Rameau and established by Debussy, also in chapter 13. So we should eagerly wait for chapter 13. There's a lot of stuff that's going to get done there. And also because Mozart, the great melodist, often used the descending major sixth, we shall choose that interval anew. As like the second key melody. It's got sort of a Bernstein. But I think here he's talking about sung words. If we refer back to that hierarchy of spirit to liturgy to text to chant, within that context, and within the very generic description of melody that he's working with right now, the major sixth is kind of that overarching, and then the and he's referring to chapter 13. Chapter 13 said we'll do a lot of work. In this chapter 10, he is referring forward to that chapter in many cases. We should be thinking about this melodic contour as laying out the rules of the game. Right? He did this with the rhythmic section as well, where he talked about, before he got into the details of augmentation, diminution, the cross, the point, all of the very detailed technical ones, he wanted us to understand what pulse was and what rhythm was. These very basic concepts. He's doing the same with melody. There's an idea of a shape, and we're going to start to talk about some key intervals that form the shape for us. We start with the descending augmented fourth, what I'd been calling the tritone, and now the melodic sixth. So again, for the sixth, he's looking first within the classical repertoire. He looks at some Grieg, and example 80. So there's your sixth between the first note, the G, and the last note, the E, and in between you. Now, what happens if we take that and then pass it through the compositional techniques that we've talked about, with the focus on the tritone and the sixth? So the right hand in example 81. Our melodic sixth is in the first measure between the A and the F sharp, and then of course we have the cadential tritone. The left hand is this beautiful this is from one of Messiaen's earlier piano preludes. reflet dans le vent, a reflection in the wind. Then there's a couple of other shorter melodic examples of the same thing. Example 82 from one of his orchestral pieces. All right, there's your E to C sharp. So the idea of building in the boundaries maybe of the melody, but as the sixth, there's the upper and lower bounds of the melody, within which you then have a cadential gesture of the tritone. So let's dig a bit into example 99, which is taken from the quartet, it's part of the piano part of one of the movements. Example 99 develops our formula by contrary motion in A, normal motion in B, retrograde motion in D, interversion of the notes in C and E, superposes two modes of limited transposition, see chapter 16. So this paragraph really condenses the future of the next 5 chapters, really. It lays out the techniques of melodic development. The language very similar to rhythmic development, retrograde, inversion, extension, addition at the point. Those are concepts that Messiaen used in the rhythmic development, and it makes sense that he would have the same patterns, the same sort of meta ideas that he would apply to melody. I think the characteristics to look out for here is cell A begins on a G and ends on a G flat, and the contour goes down and then up. And again, remember, this is very basic. Messiaen is not yet talking about the theoretical complexities of his process. He's laying out the ideas first so that we come in understanding some of the general rules of engagement. So that if A starts high, goes down, and is bounded melodically by the minor second at the beginning and the end, well then B goes up and down, noodles around the same chromatic pitches at the top, right? G, G flat, F, and is melodically constructed the same way with the minor second between the first note and the second note. Between C and D, right? The last note. This is more expansive, and we'll talk more about retrograde and inversion as a melodic evolution in those future chapters. But you can see again, C has the G flat, G F, right? So does D. And the lower notes are B flat and C. This is a wonderful example of the statement Messiaen makes at the beginning of the chapter, where melody is supreme and the harmony is there as necessary for the melody. If I play through this, you can hear how the harmony really shimmers around the melody. I'd love to play the quartet. I'd love to be able to play it, and then I'd love to find people to play it, to play it with. So then Messiaen starts to talk about folk songs. And he says something very interesting about a folk song. He says, let us remember them to pass them through the deforming prism of our language. So let's think about that a minute, right? So he talks about these folk songs that he knew as a child, Russian folk songs, French folk songs, that he still remembers, and that he remembers loving as a child. They come through and they form these kernels of ideas about the shape of a melody, up in very basic language, up, down, noodling around certain characteristics. Now he's a composer with his own maturing aesthetic that is interested in a different harmonic language and in a different rhythmic language. But the impulse that is at the core of his musical recollection are these folksong melodies and these plain chant melodies from the church. So when he talks about the prism of our language, right, the deforming prism, it is the compositional craft applied to the initial impulse of the creative urge, which in many cases is a memory of something, a memory from childhood, or an unarticulatable idea that can only come through the craft that we have at hand. And Messiaen in this textbook is defining the craft he has at hand, the available tools and the processes that he has. So for a folk song, he starts with this Russian folk song, and he draws the parallel immediately between this folk song and the Boris Godunov example, which makes a lot of sense because Mussorgsky, as a Russian composer, was also immediately and imminently influenced by the folk songs of Russia, as was Stravinsky. I think you can hear Stravinsky in a lot of this as well. But here's the melody. There it is, right? Now, in Messiaen's language, the melody becomes notice the unharmonic spelling of the D sharp to E flat in preparation for the cadence. I think that's part of his idiosyncratic harmonic language, is that the D sharp to A is not the same as E flat to A. He wants the diminished fourth, not the augmented third. What a beautiful, beautiful ending. Now, melodically, both phrases, the first phrase at the end of the second measure and the second phrase at the end of the fourth measure, end on the melody A, right, with the right hand dissonant interval underneath it. But if you look and see, the cadence is different. That's the first time through, and the second time through is second time through it has the diminished fourth. The first time does not. So I think we're seeing the difference between what a true and a false cadence, or plagal cadence, or however you want to say it, within the deforming prism of Messiaen's language. So I thought I would wrap up by playing a melody that I'm working on right now, which, as I look at it, has some of the same characteristics of, particularly of chromatic harmony supporting tritone melodic intervals, uh, especially in a cadential form. Um, I'm just gonna play it, and I'll snapshot. You can see I'm still working on a sketch. I've titled it as a mazurka, and I'm working on it in a kind of envisioning it as a Chopin-esque mazurka. But ultimately, this is going to be part of a song cycle. I'm just trying to figure out some of these harmonies because I want the cadence and I want the contours to be coherent. They aren't yet. But you can hear, I think, where I'm trying to go with some of this and some of the influences in the Messiaen work that you can see in this. Right, that cadence. I'll talk a little bit here. The last two measures. Yeah.